Hey guys, welcome to the second anticipated objection to Smart's identity thesis in the strict sense. Last time we talked about whether or not the fact that somebody who has no knowledge of what something is actually in one ontological way, like for instance lightning, we may see or we understand the sensation of it, which is a true way of explaining its existence, but we don't really understand that it is the same thing as the electrical discharge. And the same could be said about the evening star being the same as the morning star, or the evening star being Venus. We talked about, well, using the criteria of the strict identity thesis, how can we actually prove that it's the same thing? And the quite clear argument developed by Smart was, well, just because a person has knowledge of A but not knowledge of B doesn't mean B doesn't exist. For example, just because a person has knowledge of how they sense and their sensual experience of lightning doesn't mean that lightning is not also ontologically a ionic discharge of electrical energy, if you get what I mean. So the point is that just because a person doesn't have knowledge of it doesn't mean that's not what it is. Then he went on to point out that we often, when an external trigger makes us experience a particular brain state, which is what he believes the sense datum is, or the sensory experience is actually a brain state, something triggered off in the brain. It is contingent or directly related to the brain processes. And I think now what he's going to try and do is he's going to prove to us that actually no, our brain state or our sensory experience is the same thing as the brain processes ontologically. They may appear to be contingent, i.e. when the brain thing happens, the sensation happens, and they almost, using that language, sound completely independent. But he's going to try and prove, well, actually, no, they're just two ontological sides of the same ontological coin. Maybe I shouldn't say ontological sides of the same coin, I should say two reported sides of the same ontological coin. Okay? So let's see how he does that. Well, we've got a bit of theory to work through today. So we're going to explore Smart's reply to his second anticipated objection to his thesis. And to do that, we need to do what we usually do: name, define, and interrelate different terms. We need to recap on terms that we covered in Year 11. Also, we need to look at this idea of necessity and contingency. Then we need to explore a summary of how he replies to his second anticipated possible objection. And of course, we read the more nuanced development of that as we actually read what he explained in the text. So can you write these 4 success criteria down for me and score yourself out of 4 for each one? And once you've done that, I want you to look at this picture. And I just want you to tell me if you report seeing something different when compared to a friend. And then I want you to tell me whether or not you're referring to the same thing or if what you're seeing is actually different. Okay, so let's go through some theory we covered in Year 11, and we also covered when we were talking a bit about Descartes. Okay, so if you remember Year 11, we pretty much understood that when we're talking about mathematical logic or mathematical arguments, it's usually presented in the form of axioms. Now, axioms are what we call necessary or a priori or rational truths. They're also what we call analytical truths. And, you know, one key thing we can explain here is if we look at a right angle when two lines kind of intersect in a perpendicular way, you know, that concept of a right angle just seems to be something that doesn't need to be proven using the methods of science, observed over time. It just seems to be that it exists, right? It has what we call a modal necessity. In other words, across all possible worlds that can be imagined, or that could exist, a right angle is always going to be a right angle. And it's also something we know before experience. That's why we call it a priori. And it's figured out by exploring tautologies or implied meanings. And it's analytical because, again, it's found out again through tautology. So all these words here are pretty much synonymous. There's that word necessity is really important because, you know, we understand that it's necessary that in all possible worlds that a right angle must be a right angle, a circle can never have a straight edge, these kind of concepts, okay? Now, of course, we did get a bit deeper because we wanted to. This man comes along, his name is Immanuel Kant, and says, hey, I found a different kind of knowledge, which is a synthetic a priori. We don't usually get into that, but it's something you might want to look at. We don't really need to get into that when we're exploring SMART. But if we look at the circumference divided by a diameter, this geometrical proof, if we divide a circumference by its diameter, we end up getting pi. Now, this is what we call a synthetic a priori because there's nothing in the circumference and there's nothing in the diameter that when you analyze them in terms of their definitions, gives you the concept of pi. The combination of these two a priori truths, in other words, the synthesis of them, ends up generating something outside of their predicates, which is the concept of pi. Hence, we get what we call synthetic a priori knowledge. And you might want to just explore that. You might want to have a look at that because that'll keep you interested. Now, of course, there is another type of way of thinking. You could say logic, but I think maybe another type of metaphysics would be a better way of saying it. And it's usually related to science, but science is also heavily what we call deductive, which means it's rational a priori, necessary, and uses axioms as well. But when we're testing it through the testing method of science, when we test a hypothesis, we end up exploring what we call contingent logic. And contingent logic is what we call a posteriori. It's something we know after experience. It's empirical rather than rational, and it's synthetic. Now, this word synthetic is really important because what it means is, unlike a typical a priori truth, all bachelors are unmarried because the definition of a bachelor is such that it is unmarried, so you basically imply through an analysis of tautology what's been implied in the concept. In a synthetic statement, you basically combine two independent events and then you use them to formulate what we call evidence. So let's have a look at this, okay? Let's explain what we mean. If I find that every time I heat a bottle of water to 100 degrees, obviously it's a glass bottle, so it doesn't melt, but I heat it to 100 degrees, it starts to evaporate, it boils, it turns into steam. Now, what we're seeing is water and we're seeing steam. Now, we know that the two are the same thing, but what if we say heat and water, okay? What if we say 100 degrees and water? There's nothing in water that implies 100 degrees, is there? So when we see these two independent things occur together, we get a new observation, which is the creation of steam, and that's what we call a synthetic event, or it's a piece of evidence. Science gives us evidence, and evidence is usually synthetic statements. Like if we heat a bottle of water to 100 degrees, it'll start to boil and create steam. All right, so take a note about the difference. Okay, we've got a priori, which is based on this kind of tautological, necessary, rational logic, and then we've got a posteriori, which is contingent, and that's probably the most important word. It's based on after observation, it's synthetic. It's in situations where the subjects don't imply the predicates. In fact, you've got to apply other subjects or other predicates to the subject to get extra bits of knowledge that exists outside of what is implied by the subject. All right, now the most important word for the whole reading of this second argument is the argument of contingent. Contingent means that it's something that you find out through observing in time and space. And because you observe it through time and space, it doesn't have any kind of rational in the strict sense basis for it occurring. It's almost like it occurs per chance. And usually people use the word contingency plan to mean chance plan. So, like, we find out usually that dominoes, when they hit another domino, tend to make other dominoes fall, right? But it's something you have to experience in time and space to see it happen. And there's no kind of further kind of necessary proof that it will happen. So it's kind of happening by chance. Contingency is really important. You need to get a definition of contingency written down. So the good thing about synthetic evidence is it meets what we call Karl Popper's criteria of falsifiability. We don't need to explain that. But basically, evidence, despite attempts to disprove it, is always going to be evidence if it can't be disproved. So if you can't falsify evidence, even though you're going out of your way to find like ways that it can be wrong, it is definitely evidence. It stays as evidence. And hence, evidence needs to be always formulated in a way where it can be found wrong, which is a good observation by Karl Popper. If you want to read more about the contingent versus necessary statements and knowledge and stuff like that, go to YouTube and look up Hume and do some research on Hume's fork. Have a look at what Kant said about synthetic a priori knowledge, and have a look at what Karl Popper said about falsifiability. There's some really good areas to go to YouTube and basically do some research. Alrighty, so let's go to objection 2. Alright, which is basically it can only be contingent. That's what we sense. It can only be a contingent statement that if we say what we sense is a brain process. In other words, we can only really know the correlations between the brain process and the sensations. It can't be proved in any way, shape, or form as a kind of necessary truth. It's only a contingent truth. That's the observation. So, as our mate Jack Nicholson would always say to us, you know, you can't handle the truth. You just can't handle the truth. All right. So, if it is contingent and it's really just evidence, then what's to say? And it's evidence that's constantly being found true in a fact that you go and you're trying to find it false. You've invented ways to find it false, right? Well, it's only really going to stay true and it's only going to stay proof until it is found wrong. Now, again, let's go back to that example of Aristotle saying that the brain was just a cooling mechanism. Well, we now know that that's completely wrong. So was it true when Aristotle said that the brain was a cooling mechanism, that it was a cooling mechanism? Well, no. So what he's basically saying is it could be true that in the future, right, we find a completely different way of explaining what occurs in our brains. Remember too, there were some ancient Greeks that thought that thoughts occurred in the heart and were more related to heart-based processes. So what's to say that in the future, we're going to find out that these brain processes aren't just something completely different, completely different. Therefore, an after image is only just a report of what we see. And maybe in possible future cases, or maybe we could say even now, because it's only a report, we don't definitively know that it is a brain process. It's just a correlation with the because it's contingent. Why don't we just say, therefore, it isn't a brain process, right? Who knows? In the future, it could be wrong. Therefore, maybe it isn't, you know? Let's read that objection in its language, shall we? Objection 2. It is only a contingent fact, if it is a fact, that when we have a certain kind of sensation, and this is the brain state he was referring to before, sensation, or it's the sense datum he was referring to before, there is a certain kind of process in our brain. In other words, we experience one, we observe the other. They tend to coincide or they correlate. Indeed, it is possible, though perhaps in the highest degree unlikely, that our present physiological theories will be out of date as the ancient theory connecting mental processes with the going on in the heart were. So we're saying we used to think that the heart was where mental processes occur. We know that's ridiculously stupid and out of date. And he's saying, look, if it follows that then that when we report on sensations, we are not reporting on brain processes, because in the future, we could be wrong in the future. All right? So take a note. Alrighty, now we get into some really complex theory, okay? Now we got to start thinking a little bit about, you know, how we're talking about the linguistic turn. There's a really good area of philosophy. I quite like it, but we don't teach it. It's called structuralism. Probably don't teach it because it's related to sociology as well, so that gets covered in other parts of the VCE curriculum. But basically, structuralism and semiotics argues that there's always a relationship between two things. We have what we call the signifier or the sign, and we have, no, the sign is the combination of the signifier and the signified, okay? So if we have a word a word kind of is a signifier. It makes us immediately think of some kind of meaning which is outside of it or above it. So it refers to it. And in the case we've got Fido and we've got the dog Fido. And there is this kind of really simplistic theory of meaning, which we call the Fido-Fido theory, which is that when we say Fido, it corresponds directly to Fido, okay? And the best way to kind of define this in the abstract is say that the signifier refers directly to its object or its referent. Can you take a note? Now he's saying when we talk about the phenomenon of brain processes, this just doesn't apply, okay? When we report the fact that we see lightning, right, it doesn't mean that we are reporting the fact that we see the ionic accumulation and then discharge. But remember, they are ontologically the same thing. So outside of the way that language is constructed to report both different versions of the same thing, we know that really we are referring to the same thing. So it's almost like the meanings that we ascribe in the two different sensations. In this case, we're talking about the meaning of sensation here. In this case, we're talking about the scientific meaning, are just different meanings that refer to the same ontological object. Take a note. So they are the same. We're speaking about the same thing, or we're referring to the same thing when we talk about sensation or when we talk about brain processes. Take a note. And a good way to kind of encapsulate this objection is that meaning something is different doesn't mean at all that something that it's signifying is different. So if I use a different meaning to describe the way that I see lightning versus if I use my sensations to describe that lightning, that's not doesn't mean that I'm not referring to the same object as I would when I use science and when I use the language of processes, brain processes, which could be referring to the same object. Different meaning or meaning something different doesn't mean that what's being referred to is different. Take a note. So in this case, the Fido-Fido thing doesn't apply because there isn't one corresponding sign that directly matches the one corresponding object. We could have many different meanings, expressions, or ways of understanding the same object, okay? So therefore, it's not contingent because ontologically it's the same. Because meaning, right, is not, just because it means two different things doesn't mean it is two things, all right? I guess the point that I've got here is meaning does not equal two different things. Just because something can be described two different ways doesn't mean that it is two different things. But when you talk about contingency, which is usually, obviously the predicate is implied, it's usually the subject doesn't apply the predicate, or you've got two separate events that tend to occur with each other. You've got an observation of two synthetically different things that occur together to produce a new phenomena. That's what contingency is. That doesn't necessarily mean, in this case, that we're talking about something different. Again, let me explain that language because this is where it gets complex. I experience the brain sensation, but I also have the brain processes. I've got two different ways of explaining what's going on. I notice that they occur together. Brain processes doesn't necessarily imply brain sensations. It's not in the definition of it. So they have a language of being contingent. But as we've gone through and we've analyzed the case of lightning, we can have different meanings that refer to the one particular object or referent. Therefore, just because we have two different types of language to describe things and make it appear or have the illusion of being contingent doesn't mean it is, because really we're just describing the one ontological thing. Take a note. So, like last time, we were really discussing the concept of if person doesn't have the language of the other process, they've only got the simple language to describe their experience of lightning or the evening star, that could be something different. Now what we're saying is that, well, actually, I've just proven that we have the brain sensation as well as the brain processes. So it appears to be something contingent is going on. But actually, it's not contingent. It's just an illusion because we've got two different types of language, two different ways of describing the same ontological phenomena. Okay? Right. Let's read and see where we go from here. Okay? Possibly objection 2 derives of its apparent strength from the Fido theory of meaning. If the meaning of an expression were what the expression named, then of course it would follow that the fact that the sensation and brain processes have different meanings that they cannot name one and the same thing. Let's go over this again. If the meaning of an expression were what the expression named, then of course it would follow that the sensation and brain processes have two meanings that cannot name one and the same thing. All right. So this is where it gets tricky. I'd get confused if I was in year 12. It says here, if the meaning is what it names. When it says names, it's what it's referring to. Okay? The meaning is the object or the referent. So if the meaning of an expression were exactly what it is referring to ontologically, right, then of course it would follow that sensation and brain processes have different meanings and therefore are naming and referring to different things. Okay? That's all this is saying. Take a note. All right, let's read the reply. The objection certainly proves that when I say I have an afterimage, we cannot mean something of the form I have such and such a brain process. So when I say I see the lightning or the afterimage, I'm not really meaning that I have the same brain process. I'm referring to something different. But this does not show that what we report, so what we say, having an afterimage, is not in fact a brain process. I see lightning does not mean I see an electric discharge. Indeed, it is logically possible, though highly unlikely, that the electrical discharge account of lightning might one day be given up. In other words, you're saying we might have got it wrong. Again, I see the evening star does not mean the same thing as I see the morning star, and yet the evening star and the morning star are one and the same thing. Is a contingent proposition. So when it makes sense, if I say an evening star and the morning star are the same thing, remember evening star does not imply morning star, but when I say they are one and the same thing, this is a contingent idea. Okay, so if you have what we call the Fido theory of meaning, which means that what you mean is what you name, take a note, then of course this all breaks down. But I reject the Fido theory of meaning, is what he says. So possibly objection 2 derives some of its apparent strength from a Fido theory of meaning, which is what you say is what you name. Okay? In other words, your meaning is directly to what you basically report. You report only what you mean. What you mean is direct naming of the object. If the meaning of an expression were what the expression named, here he says it again, then of course it would follow the fact that sensation and brain processes have different meanings and that they cannot name one and the same thing. But the thing is, and his argument is pretty clearly, he basically says, guess what? We are naming the same thing, we're just using different language to report it. Alright, so that's the end of the video, and it was actually really, really complex, and I think the only way that you can kind of get objection 2 is to understand the concept of something being ontologically different from the way it's linguistically described. If you kind of understand that, you really do get that argument. So obviously, I mean something different when I say I see lightning as opposed to there are brain processes, creates the illusion of contingency, right? Because basically we think that the statements are referring to something that is ontologically different, i.e. the sensation or the brain state is a different experience, a different thing to the actual brain process. But that only really works if you assume the Fido assumption of meaning, which is that what we say directly corresponds to the object through its meaning. That's not necessarily the case. What we mean may name and correspond to or refer to something very different, which is ontologically the same thing. All right? That's pretty complex. And if you have any issues, please feel free to come and talk to me about it, because it's one of those arguments that you need to know. You will be asked to reply to it. Okay? Come and talk to me if you have issues. That's very, very important. Cheers.